Which teams can the Jazz emulate in the pathway to contention? Find out next on Locked On Jazz.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Jazz. My name's Leif Thulin. I'm excited to fill in for David Locke with you once more on Locked On Jazz. As many of you guys know by now, I'm a lifelong Jazz fan, credentialed NBA draft analyst, attending the 23 and 24 NBA combines, Utah Jazz broadcast assistant, statistician each of the past 4 seasons, lover of college hoops, so I'll make sure you know what you need to know about your beloved Utah Jazz. Thanks for making Locked On Jazz your first listen each and every day. And remember, Locked On Jazz is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube at Locked On Jazz, where the best way to help us grow is to comment anything below. And today's question is, which pathway to contention to follow do you think the Jazz can emulate most easily, and which one's the most effective? This episode is brought to you by Monarch Money, so take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. And today on the show, I'll examine the comparison to 3 different NBA teams that I think the Jazz can try to copy and how they built their team based on roster composition similarities and the pathway being the Jazz not very good right now to hopefully being good. These teams all got their similar ways, but I think the Jazz are only a few years behind these teams. So let's dive right in. The first team is the Detroit Pistons. The Pistons are not true contenders, I know, so you guys might get mad at that, but I think they're not true contenders yet. In my opinion, they have a true path that enables them to contend for the next few years and beyond that, though. And that's what the Jazz want to be able to do. So how are the Jazz similar, you may ask? The Jazz plodded along in mediocrity for a couple of years and didn't reap the rewards of lottery fortune. And what I mean by that is lottery fortune gets you the top couple picks. The Jazz highest pick has been 5, and they were picking 9th and 10th the years prior to that. So to me, that's not having true directionality. Like, I liked Austin Ainge's intention when he traded and cleared the pathway, cleared the cupboard, and said, okay, Colin Sexton, we'll make a losing trade in terms of value in order to clear the cupboard and be intentional. I liked the move for getting rid of John Collins despite a fantastic season. Like, that's intentionality that I think the Jazz had lacked prior. So the Pistons, the similarity would be they had similar misfortune in the lottery largely. Emphasis on largely. They did get one great pick. The Pistons were a team who could be an 8 seed for a while. I'm going to go back a couple years. I'm going to talk about the pathways. But they were, for two years in a row, I want to say they're an 8 seed, and the transition to being bad to good again wasn't smooth as many others that are more highlighted, like the Thunder. The Thunder were, great with Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook. Then it became just Russell Westbrook, and they were not quite as good, but, they were still in the playoffs. And then it was like, okay, we got to redo this, and everything's got to be redone. And in doing so, they were awful, truly awful for a couple of years. There were lineups with players that diehard NBA fans would love to have an immaculate grid. And that was the right thing to do. And it's been proven by them winning a championship through their draft. And of course, they made an astute move in getting Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. But the Thunder are the highlighted rebuild, but not everyone has the assets the Thunder do. So let's revisit what the Pistons did to get to where they are now. The Pistons seasons that led to their rise were the Pistons were 41-41 in 2019. That was their last year of true effort to win prior to this past season. In between, they went 20-46 in the COVID-shortened year. Then they went 20-52, 23-59, 17-65, 14-68, and then this past year 44-38, and could have beaten the New York Knicks in the opening round in the playoffs, and the Knicks made the Eastern Conference Finals. Like, to me, they're not that far away from contending in the East, particularly because of the injuries of Jason Tatum and Tyrese Haliburton. However, the Jazz hopefully don't need to be that bad, that long. But the point that I'm trying to make is they tanked after a slight bit of indecision. And they got their number one man at number 1. That's Cade Cunningham. And he was an all-NBA performer last year early in his career. And, I think they could have been better sooner if he hadn't had injury issues. But actually, that may have helped them in a weird, backwards way. The way to get true contention, I think, is you need to get one of those I'm him type of players. And the Cade Cunningham has been that at every level. The Jazz need one of those guys, and that's why I liken the two teams. Let's go through their history of picks and why I see it as comparable there, but also encouraging. it's encouraging that the Pistons can have young talent that's outside of Cade Cunningham without having the top picks every year. They had horrible records. A couple of those years, they were the number one odds to get the number one pick, like the Jazz just were, and ended up further down. So I think it's encouraging that those other players turn out useful, maybe not stars, but useful. And it's not just the number one can't miss guy. And that's the only way to do it. Like these other guys are similar in helping bring the Pistons up. Cade is the catalyst, but everyone else needs to be there. And so if you draft well on those picks, then you have a way to get those guys. All right. So Cade basically proves, essentially, I'll walk that back a little bit for you guys. I think you need a number one guy, and the next team we're going to talk about has one too. But you need a guy who's his ability is to be an all NBA talent, a franchise changing talent. The terms I always use. But I think the Jazz aren't that far away, because if the Jazz can draft any of AJ, Darren Peterson, or Cam Boozer with the current core, they can instantly propitiate their way into the Western Conference title contention 3 years from now when those guys reach their prime, when Ace Bailey reaches their prime, when Lauri Markkanen's still on the roster and Walker Kessler can continue to ascend. Like that doesn't seem that far-fetched to me, but you need to do well in the picks preceding the Cade Cunninghams, the AJ DeBonsas, the Darren Petersons. So Cade proves that one good year with one star, now the total trajectory of the franchise has shifted. So let's go through their picks now. They went 7th in 2020, and they drafted Killian Hayes. That was a bad pick. In 2021, they got number 1 and took Cade. In 2022, they had the worst record in the NBA and got Ivy at 5. And that was a good pick. He's been injury prone, though, and so that's stunted their growth. In 2023, once again, they got the 5th pick and got Osar Thompson. And in 2024, they took Ron Holland at 5. They also had Jalen Duren, who I love. I had him number 5 on my big board in 2022, and they got him at 13. So really good draft in that year. So I think the larger point being Cade Cunningham is in control. He's the pilot. But I would say, other than Killian Hayes, Jaden Ivey's been very good when healthy. I don't know if he's a top 5 return in that class, but he's not too far off. Jalen Duren's probably better than Jaden Ivey, so that's really good. Osar at 5 is as good as you're going to get at 5. And Ron Holland, the jury's still out. The point being is this team has a lot of good players, but what takes you to the land of promise is having one star drafting first, but it doesn't work if you only have one hit. Like there's been so many teams that have had prolonged tanks because they've drafted poorly. Like think of the 76ers, how many cracks at the bat they had before getting Embiid and Simmons. Like they drafted a lot of guys. So how does this apply to the Jazz? The Jazz drafted 9th, 10th, and 5th the last 3 seasons, and getting one can change the trajectory easily. Like had they gotten Cooper Flagg, I think we'd be all superbly happy about what's happening. But drafting well at spots that you land at is vital, and the Jazz have work to do seeing how well those last 3 perform. Hendricks, Cody, Ace, but it does appear that the Jazz have steals and Flip, Key, and Collier per draft position. Basically, my contention is you need as many at-bats as possible, and it really only takes one home run and a few base hits to score in the draft. You don't need to hit multiple home runs. It would be nice, but you're more able to build a team with singles all the way leading to the Grand Slam, and that's what the Jazz pathway is. Detroit had an arduous path that the Jazz need not suffer, but it could expedite. Like the Jazz could expedite the process, and I think they're in a good example of what a pathway to success looks like in the modern era. Not many like rookies can come in and be LeBron James and take your team to the championship very quickly. That just doesn't happen. The Pistons are giving you a timeline that the Jazz, I think, can actually make faster than what the Pistons had, but it gives you an arc of like, look, those are good players at their position, but they're not, fantastic. And if they're not fantastic, but yet their trajectory has turned around just in 1 year, different coach, different belief system. Cade Cunningham's taken a leap by year 4, and a couple of those years he's been hurt. Jaden Ivey's been hurt at different times, and the team ascends together. You have a contender in time. And I think the Jazz can really believe that this is a way to do it and actually could be better served than the Pistons because they have more trade assets and more draft picks due to their trades clearing house of Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell, which the Pistons lacked. All righty, well, coming up next, I'll look at a team who took a slightly different approach to relevance in the East, but one I think that the Jazz can also emulate. Find out about them and many more teams coming your way next on Locked On Jazz. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or on your phone. So Monarch does the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in just minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. Oh, thank goodness there. So, for example, I did not know that I was still paying for a Hulu until recently. And Monarch helped me immediately spot a few subscriptions that I wasn't using, Hulu being one of them, and canceling those alone saved me money every single month that I didn't know I was losing. So don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com in your browser in your browser, half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNBA. Welcome back to Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin. The next team that comes to mind for me as a potential rebuild success story to replicate for the Jazz did it slightly differently than the Pistons, but there's one common denominator. For me, it's the Orlando Magic. The Magic should be, in my opinion, this is a bold prediction. Maybe you guys can agree or disagree in the comments on this one too. But I think the Magic should finish as a top 3 finisher in the East in the regular season and should win a round or two in the playoffs. And their pathway there has some similarities to the Pistons, but it was less direct in terms of being awful for a prolonged period. The Pistons were 2 of the 3 years that I mentioned, the worst team in the NBA. The Magic were never that. And they were not awful for a prolonged period, which many Jazz fans detest the idea of being awful for a prolonged period in order to get a good pick. And this provides an option that is alternate, but it still has one common denominator, which we'll get to. And thus, this would be an alluring type for many Jazz fans to believe in. The Magic, let's go through their history. So the Magic made the playoffs in both 2019 and 2020, and they were led by a veteran like Nikola Vucevic. He was leading the team. He was on the team a little bit longer, but they lost some of their veterans, and he was a holdover. The next year, he was still on the roster. The Magic went 21-51 in 21. Then they fired Skiles and brought in a new coach and went 22-60. Then 34-48, which isn't good, but for year 3 of a rebuild. So mind you, that's year 3 of a rebuild, but year 2 of a new coach. To me, 34-48 of year 2 of a new coach and what is year 3 of a rebuild where they didn't win the lottery is very good in terms of they didn't win the lottery the years prior, meaning that it's a totally new team formulating the team that is actually improving. Of course, they did win the lottery and get Paolo Banchero entering that season. And then they went the year prior to last, 47-35. To me, that's a fantastic rebuild. The year after, the most recent year, they went 41-41, but they were riddled with injury issues. So I'm choosing to ignore that. But let's revisit that. For perspective, and let's put it back to the Jazz perspective, because this is a history you guys know. This would be year 4 of the Jazz rebuild after tearing it down to the studs. And for year 3 of Hardy, that was last year, and the Jazz won 17 games. And that was year 3 of Mosley, in which they went 47-35. That said, the Jazz had a different type of teardown. The Magic still kept a lot of their youthful core that could coalesce and ascend together. The Jazz took away their entire core, and then they had 1 or 2 holdovers left, and then traded them in the midseason, which caused what was a good start to go awry and get the 9th pick. Then the next year, they're 26-26, and the wheels fell off and went 5-25 in the final 30 games. And yes, you can make the argument it's intentional. I wouldn't fight you on that. And then last year, we all know what happened, 17-65. But my point being is the Magic had a similar experience of where they tore it down to the studs. They just didn't have true absolute beasts like Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell elevating to the level the Jazz were elevated, which frankly wasn't that much further in the playoffs than the Magic were. We were far better as a team, but we couldn't get much further. And that's how minute the differences in the NBA are. Like the Jazz were far better, but they only went around further in a lot of those years. They lost in the same round as the Magic did at the start of their rebuild. First round loss for Magic in 1920. The Jazz lost in the first round in 22. That's how it happened. or excuse me, in 21/22. So how'd they do it? They had a team of largely lottery drafted players that grew together and formed an identity based on their individual strengths. Most of these players, the individual strength would be defense. And that's kind of a rare breed right now. So then their draft picks, they drafted Cole Anthony 15th in 2020. You'd say that's a success to a degree, but in a redraft, he might be 15th, might be 20th. They drafted Jalen Suggs at 5, and that was a year they were pretty bad. But they also drafted Franz Wagner at 8 in 2021, and that was a hit and a half at 8. Then they got Paolo Banchero at 1 in 2022, Anthony Black at 6, and Jet Howard at 11 in more recent years. And that makes a big difference, right? Like, so that is a big deal. They had the 5th pick, the 8th pick, the 1st pick, the 6th pick. And that's really important. The Jazz right now 10-9-5. So they have the cracks at the bat once more, but they also weren't intentionally losing at the same rate that the Jazz had to turn it into getting the 10th and 9th pick. Now the Jazz didn't have the talent last year and got the worst record in the NBA, but the 5th pick. It's a bit of misfortune. So there is a little bit of a difference there. The idea made here is that some of these picks actually are not that great of picks for the position of the pick, but they do have NBA skills that help stick in the NBA and then help an NBA roster. So I'll elaborate. I'd argue Jalen Suggs is a good player, but not worth the 5th pick. And I'd argue the same for Anthony Black at 6. I disliked the Jet Howard pick all day on the draft at number 11. I thought it was a terrible pick. So, and he has not done anything. So that's a bad pick. My point being, they've missed on a lot of picks in terms of like, are they worth the value? But they found an identity of, hey, what are you good at? Suggs is a fantastic on-the-ball defender. Anthony Black is a hound on the ball, and he's also a pretty good creator. They also have had picks that preceded the tenure I brought up, but Jonathan Isaac has been injury-prone, but when he plays, he's a defensive anchor that's as good as anyone in the NBA due to positional versatility and defensive excellence. Wendell Carter is a guy they received in a trade for Nikola Vucevic, and he's gotten better, and he's helped anchor a very good defensive team. And those were high picks whose their name is made on defense. None of those guys have lived up to where they were drafted. So they have had misses, and they have had hits, but their team was able to form an identity, defense, and being hard to score upon, and they were ascending when they got two. So they formed a team, they formed an identity, and then their ascent took off when they got 2 stars in Franz Wagner and Paolo Banchero. Neither of whom are perfect by any means, but are both very talented, and they're in the form of the modern NBA star. Paolo, I think, is spectacular, and many criticize his efficiency, but I think you guys are going to learn to realize he's unbelievable. He went number 1. I had him number 1 that year, and maybe I'm biased because of that. And he's been great. And as much as I adore Jalen Williams, and we'll talk about him in a moment as well, and I adore Jalen Williams, I might be his biggest fan, at least early in his career. Paolo will end up going number 1 in redraft when all is said and done. And that's from a Jalen Williams stan. Jalen Williams, it was a second-team All-NBA member. He was all defense. He's unbelievable. Paolo is going to be the better player in the NBA. He's a rare franchise cornerstone, in my opinion. And Franz, many believe, is better. I don't think so, but he certainly is a steal at 8. So that's how a team can build, right? You can get 2 stars, 1 superstar potential guy, and 1 a multiple-time all-star, and have dudes that are bought in as ancillary pieces. And those dudes that are bought in the way that I believe that correlates with the Utah Jazz is Cody Williams and Taylor Hendricks, in my opinion, are not going to live up to their draft slot. That's just the way I see it. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong by a mile. But they are 2 guys who have traits that are rare, and they can buy in defensively and make their presence felt and help support once the more offensively oriented and the star has the ball in their hands. Furthermore, those guys recognize their traits that came in defense and their deficiencies came in shooting. And they realized, okay, like our team's really good, but we really struggle to score. They were bottom 3 in offense last year in just about every category, and yet they were still a playoff team because they bought in defensively. But the front office recognized that and made the shrewd move, parting with draft capital and a lot of it, to attain a piece that can elevate them to where they have their stars on team-friendly-ish deals in Banchero and Wagner. And then they went up and got a near all-star caliber player, Desmond Bane, who's a direct need and a very, very good player regardless of need. And I think the Jazz can use this model. You get Ace Bailey at 5, and maybe he's the steal. Maybe even he's the cornerstone. Maybe you get a star in the next one of the next 2 drafts, maybe both. And you have, let's say it's AJ and Ace or Darren and Ace, and you get a star for one of those drafts coming up, you have a supplementary star from another one that's the same back-to-back draft classes. And with supplementary pieces, it becomes how well the Kyle Filipowskis, the Taylor Hendricks, and those guys develop. And then the assets that the Jazz possess from the Rudy and Donovan deals give the Jazz more flexibility to make deals that the Magic could not make because they didn't have the same way of tearing it down to the studs. Like the Magic made a trade for Nikola Vucevic. The Jazz did it for Rudy Gobert. There's a difference there. The Jazz did it for Donovan Mitchell and got a player like Lauri Markkanen plus picks. And though I said that the Jazz probably lost both those deals, and I still believe they did, now is the time to use these models as saying, okay, if the Jazz can hit on a pick, and with the new CBA, you really want to get good players to supplement when they're on rookie deals and make your push then, like the Thunder have. I think the Jazz can emulate what the Magic did and maybe even exceed what the Magic did. Coming up next, there's one more team I think their build is fascinating. I wonder if the Jazz can replicate it. This one's a little trickier, and I think it's harder to thread the needle, but I'm curious your guys' thoughts. All that and more coming ahead on Locked On Jazz. Welcome back to Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin with you here, and it's always a pleasure talking to you guys about the Utah Jazz. But this is an interesting concept, right? Like the Jazz are nowhere near contending, and the two teams I've mentioned aren't contenders yet. But the team I'm about to talk to you just played in Game 7 of the finals. It's the Indiana Pacers. They built a team in a rare way that small market teams must do at times. And if always solid like the Pacers have done, you need to be extremely astute to make up for the lack of top-tier draft picks that you'll end up having because they just haven't been bad enough to get a guy at the top. And maybe some Jazz fans are fed up with losing, which I think is the more sustainable model. But maybe some people can point to the Pacers and say, look, they did it without tanking horribly. So let's go through how they did it. The Pacers acquired their superstar, Tyrese Haliburton, and it was an astute move. It was an astute move, noticing his brand of basketball fits perfectly into their vision. And there was a spot where someone precluded him. De'Aaron Fox was in front of him and precluding him from immediate action as a star. He was able to play. He was able to showcase what he could do. But De'Aaron Fox and him both were jockeying for position. It wasn't a perfect fit. And De'Aaron Fox had money owed to him. And it made Tyrese Haliburton more available than he would have been typically, considering how good he was. However, in making that deal, they traded another all-star. That was Domantas Sabonis. That's extremely rare, but it could be something the Jazz do in some respects. That would be similar to the trade I told the Everydayers about a couple last week, I believe, when I suggested to the all-time great Gordy Chiesa. I love him to death. He's the best. But I kept nagging him, and I said, Gordy, we should trade Lowry for Jalen Williams on the Thunder, as Lowry was having the best season he's ever had in his career. He was going to be an all-star in the hometown all-star game. I saw Jalen Williams, and I said, I can't unsee how good he's going to be. I didn't even realize he'd be this good. My point being is that's similar. Domantas Sabonis was better than Tyrese Haliburton when the trade was made. Tyrese Haliburton's better than Domantas Sabonis now. Jalen Williams is better than Lauri Markkanen now. In a larger sense, the point of that is the team that made the finals had an egalitarian attack built on a roster that drafted well, but not super highly. They hit on their picks. But really what made them a contender is that they made shrewd moves to get players that were undervalued at the moment that fit their identity under Rick Carlisle. So let's go through those draft picks in a little bit. But first, I want to point about identity, right? Like sometimes guys like Rick Carlisle has been around forever and has won a championship. You know what you need. And I don't know if the Jazz have that in Will Hardy yet. I think he's a very good coach, especially on the offensive side of the ball. But it's not as obvious as it is with Carlisle with such a track record. The player that Tyrese Haliburton kind of reminds me of in terms of how quickly he processes the pace with which he plays is Jason Kidd. He doesn't play with that same force, but Jason Kidd Carlisle had Jason Kidd in Dallas. And I think that makes this fit a match made in heaven. Haliburton for Sabonis is a deal that is rare, but worked out for each player in the sense that the Pacers went all-star for future superstar, and Haliburton and Sabonis have both improved in their new homes. The Jazz could do that if they find the right piece. Now, how do they improve around Tyrese? That's the interesting piece because I don't know how easy it is to trade Lowry. This is the stuff I think the Jazz can do. Pascal Siakam was a proven commodity. He won a NBA Finals and was the second best player on the team in that series against the Warriors. He was on a team that was routinely in the playoffs and continued to improve his career. But then that team was spiraling out of control and not very good. And he was on a bad team with no intention of winning. And his numbers were good, but not great. And the Pacers dealt in their win now mode, which many questioned, myself included. I was like, oh, I wonder what they're doing there. Like, that's an interesting move. And they dealt with a team whose mindset was elsewhere. They were not trying to win the Raptors. So that forms the best two players on the Pacers that they got for what those players are now. And not that Siakam was not a proven commodity. Like Haliburton, you didn't know what he'd be, at least not to that degree, but it was still a mistake. Even then, I think many people criticized it because most people thought that Haliburton would be better than Fox, which he has become. The point being, Siakam was a known commodity, but his value was lower. They got him for pennies on the dollar. Miles Turner, so they got your best two players via trade. Miles Turner was a lottery pick, built organically. Think of him as our version of Walker Kessler. Aaron Nesmith was a lottery pick that they received in a deal, and he was thought of as the scraps in the Malcolm Brogdon deal, if I remember correctly. And he's been quite a success story and quite a reclamation project, right? Like he's turned into one of the better 3-and-D players in the NBA, and it's another good move that they've made by the front office. Benedict Mathurin is a success, picked in the top 10. He was a very good scorer, has some flaws. He doesn't pass the ball, isn't quite as aware as some of the other players on the team, but he's a good pick in the top 10. If you're to do redraft, he likely goes in the top 10 again. So you look at the roster and you see good players bought into winning. That starts with Tyrese Haliburton, but the whole team plays for one another. The part that stands out to me the most is Haliburton was seen as a movable piece at one point. Siakam was seen as a movable piece at one time, but everyone thought good but not great. But a small market team, the way to contend is so much more difficult than what the Knicks can do. Like the Knicks got Jalen Brunson because he wanted to go to New York. And he's been far better in New York than many of us would have ever dreamed. But they got Karl Anthony Towns via trade, but they can't do both those things if they're in Indiana. They can't do both those things if you're a Utah. So building a contender by picks is probably the safer way, even at the top. But you need winning deals as a small market. And whether it's deals in terms of transactions, trades, or if it's a free agency signing that's astute. It's not blockbuster trades that built the Indiana Pacers. They traded an all-star for a future all-star, but no one knew Tyrese Haliburton would be what they are. You need a little bit of luck. And the Pacers draft well at their position. The Jazz have done that with Kyle Filipowski, who's taken 32nd. Isaiah Collier, 29th. Keontae George, 16th. Those are success stories. The Jazz acquired Walker Kessler at 22nd. And that was – these are all success stories. The Jazz are going to get criticized for Cody Williams and Taylor Hendricks because at this moment they aren't living up to those expectations. But my point being, this isn't as easy to do as draft a star. But what the Pacers did is more difficult. Drafting a star at number one is the one I think is more the path that I would lean towards for the Utah Jazz. I would be bad another year, try to get another at-bat and draft a Paolo Banchero, a Cade Cunningham, maybe even better. And I just thought that it would be interesting to pose this as an option because small market teams, they don't have the luxury that some of the big teams can when winning. When they're bad, they can say, well, you know what, we're going to go get a guy. And that's something the Jazz don't have the luxury of, quite frankly. So the Jazz have 3 teams to model after here. And I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. I think the Jazz, the one I would follow is the Detroit Pistons. But believe you me, I think the Jazz can do what the Pistons and Magic did in a short period, perhaps better, because they have assets from Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell. And they can use those and maybe learn from the Pacers. Maybe it's a mix and match and learn from the Pacers to figure out, hey, we value this guy more than they're being valued, and we'll give you draft picks to go get our guy like the Magic did with Desmond Bane, like the Pacers did in getting Pascal Siakam. So let me know what you guys think. What is the best way to build a team? Which team can the Jazz most easily emulate? I really appreciate you guys for listening. Thank you guys for making Locked On Jazz your first listen today. For your second listen, find the Locked On NBA podcast where there's no offseason. Doug, Matt, and Hayes keep you up to date for contract negotiations, rumors, and everything that you need to be the most informed NBA fan. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.